one of the most dangerous things emotional pain can do is convince you that it is telling you the truth about yourself. When a man hurts you through rejection, betrayal, emotional neglect, inconsistency, or coldness, the natural human instinct is to internalize the experience. You begin asking questions that sound personal rather than practical. What is wrong with me? Why wasn't I enough? Why could he love others correctly but not me? And slowly, without realizing it, you stop evaluating the behavior and start evaluating your worth. That is where emotional suffering becomes psychologically destructive. Because pain is no longer just something you feel. It becomes something you believe. And the mind is very vulnerable during emotional disappointment. Neuroscience has shown that rejection activates many of the same neural pathways associated with physical pain. In other words, your brain often interprets emotional abandonment as danger. That is why heartbreak can affect your sleep, appetite, your concentration, and even your sense of identity. But what makes this even more complicated is that many people were conditioned long before adulthood to associate love with approval. So when approval disappears, they unconsciously assume their value disappeared with it. But another person's inability to recognize your worth does not reduce your worth. It only reveals the limits of their emotional maturity, their character, or their capacity to love. You must understand this clearly because many intelligent, compassionate people lose years of their lives trying to earn back validation from someone who was never emotionally equipped to give healthy love in the first place. They become trapped in emotional performance. They overgive, over-explain, over-sacrifice. They begin editing themselves emotionally, hoping that if they become more patient, more attractive, less emotional, less demanding, more understanding, somehow the pain will stop. But pain rooted in anat. A person's dysfunction cannot be solved through self-erasure. And this is where self-worth quietly collapses. Not through one dramatic moment, but through repeated emotional compromises that teach you to abandon yourself in order to keep someone else comfortable. The truth is, emotionally wounded people often become addicted to being chosen. Not because they are weak, but because human beings deeply desire significance. We all want to feel seen, valued, prioritized, emotionally safe. But when that desire becomes desperate, you start handing other people authority over your emotional identity. Their attention determines your confidence. Their silence determines your anxiety. Their affection determines your peace. And eventually, you no longer know who you are outside their perception of you. That is not love. That is emotional captivity. A healthy relationship should add to your identity, not define it. The moment your worth becomes dependent on another person's consistency, you come into emotional instability, because human beings are imperfect. People change, people fail, people disappoint. If your identity is built entirely on external validation, your emotional life will constantly rise and fall based on someone else's behavior. This is why emotionally strong people learn to separate rejection from identity. They grieve honestly, but they do not turn pain into self-condemnation. They understand that someone can fail to love them correctly without them becoming unworthy of love. That distinction changes everything. And notice something important here. Confidence is not pretending you were never hurt. Real confidence is remaining aware of your value while you heal. It is the ability to say, "This wounded me deeply, but it will not define me permanently." That is emotional maturity. Because if you are not careful, pain will begin rewriting your inner narrative. It will tell you you are forgettable, difficult, unlovable, replaceable. But pain is a distorted narrative. Hurt emotions often speak with certainty while lacking truth. You must learn to examine experiences without surrendering your identity to them. And sometimes the greatest act of self-respect is refusing to turn another person's poor treatment into a lifelong opinion about yourself. The way someone handled your heart reveals something about them. It does not determine the value of what they held. Never allow temporary pain to make permanent conclusions about your worth. One of the hardest truths to accept after being emotionally hurt is that closure does not always come from the person who caused the pain. Many people spend months, sometimes years, emotionally suspended because they are waiting for one final conversation, one sincere apology, one moment of honesty that will suddenly make everything make sense. They believe peace exists on the other side of an explanation. So they keep revisiting the relationship mentally, replaying conversations, analyzing behavior, searching for our hidden meaning in silence, inconsistency, or mixed signals. But the human mind struggles deeply with unresolved emotional experiences. Psychologically, people crave narrative completion. We want clear endings because uncertainty creates anxiety. And when someone hurts you without accountability, your emotions naturally resist accepting an unfinished story. That resistance is what keeps many people emotionally attached long after the relationship itself has already deteriorated. What makes this especially painful is that the wounded heart often confuses understanding with healing. You begin believing, if I could just understand why he did this, I could finally move on. But understanding someone's behavior does not always free you from its emotional consequences. In fact, sometimes the search for explanation becomes another form of emotional bondage. Because when you constantly seek closure from the person who wounded you, you unknowingly hand them continued authority over your emotional state. Your healing becomes dependent on their willingness to communicate, apologize, validate your feelings, or finally become emotionally mature. And that creates a dangerous imbalance. Your peace now rests in the hands of someone who has already shown inconsistency with your heart. There are people who will hurt you and still lack the emotional depth to explain why they hurt you. There are people who will confuse you because they are confused themselves. And there are individuals who avoid accountability not because they are powerful, but because they are emotionally unequipped to confront the damage they caused. You must understand this clearly. Not every person who breaks your heart possesses the wisdom to repair it. And this is why emotional detachment becomes necessary for healing. Detachment does not mean bitterness. It does not mean pretending you never cared. It means accepting reality without demanding that reality become different before you allow yourself peace. Blind people stay trapped because they continue negotiating emotionally with someone who has already emotionally departed. They keep trying to extract sincerity from avoidance, consistency from confusion, empathy from emotional immaturity. But healing begins when you stop asking wounded people to manage your wounds responsibly. That is a painful realization, because part of you still hopes they will suddenly become who you needed them to be. Human beings are naturally attached to potential. We often suffer not only because of who someone was, but because of who we believe they could become. And sometimes the fantasy of future change becomes stronger than the reality of present behavior. But wisdom pays attention to patterns, not promises. If someone repeatedly dismisses your feelings, avoids responsibility, manipulates your empathy, or gives affection inconsistently, your emotional system eventually becomes exhausted. You begin living in cycles of temporary hope, followed by disappointment. One good moment keeps you attached through 10 painful ones. This creates what psychologists often describe as intermittent reinforcement, one of the strongest forms of emotional addiction. The uncertainty itself intensifies attachment. And this is why some people feel emotionally trapped even when they know the relationship is unhealthy. They are not addicted to love. They are addicted to relief. Relief from anxiety. Relief from uncertainty. Relief from emotional withdrawal. So when the person finally gives attention again, it feels powerful not because the relationship is healthy, but because the nervous system temporarily escapes distress. But emotional freedom begins when you stop confusing emotional intensity with emotional safety. You do not need another person's permission to heal. You do not need a perfect explanation to move forward. And you do not need someone to fully understand your pain before you decide your life still deserves peace. Sometimes closure is by a conversation. Sometimes closure is a decision to stop reopening wounds in search of answers that may never come, a decision to stop chasing clarity from someone committed to confusion, a decision to believe what their actions already revealed. And there comes a moment in every healing journey where maturity quietly says, I may never receive the apology I deserved, but I will no longer allow that absence to control my future. Do not wait for someone else to unlock the door to your healing. Some doors only open when you finally stop knocking. One of the clearest signs that emotional pain has taken control of a person's life is when they lose the ability to protect their own peace. They become emotionally reactive to everything. Every delayed message feels personal. Every change in tone creates anxiety. Every moment of distance triggers fear. And without realizing it, they begin living emotionally at the mercy of another person's behavior. That is an exhausting way to seize decisions and live, because your emotional stability becomes dependent on circumstances you cannot control. This is why boundaries are not cruelty. Boundaries are emotional intelligence in practice. Many people misunderstand boundaries because they associate them with rejection, punishment, or emotional coldness. But healthy boundaries are not walls designed to keep love out. They are standards designed to protect your mental and emotional well-being. They define what behavior you will accept, what behavior you will not tolerate, and how you expect to be treated consistently. Without boundaries, relationships slowly become environments where emotional chaos replaces emotional safety. And the unfortunate reality is that some people only recognize your value after they lose unrestricted access to you. As long as you are always available, always forgiving, always explaining, always emotionally accessible despite repeated disrespect, there is no incentive for growth or accountability. Human nature of and takes for granted what appears endlessly available. This is why emotional restraint carries power, not manipulation, not silent games, not pretending not to care. Real emotional restraint is the ability to remain grounded without constantly reacting impulsively to emotional discomfort. It is the discipline to pause before speaking out of anger. It is the wisdom to stop over-explaining yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you. It is the strength to recognize when continued conversation no longer produces clarity, but only drains your dignity. Some people believe that the louder they express pain, the more likely they are to finally be understood. But emotionally unhealthy individuals often do not respond to intensity with empathy. They respond with avoidance, defensiveness, or control. And this creates a tragic cycle where one person becomes increasingly emotional while the other becomes increasingly distant. You cannot force emotional maturity out of someone through desperation. In fact, one of the most transformative moments in personal growth occurs when you stop trying to convince people to care correctly. Because the truth is, people reveal their priorities through consistent behavior, not occasional words. Someone who values your emotional well-being does not repeatedly place you in situations that destroy your peace and then blame you for reacting to the damage. And this is where silence becomes misunderstood. Silence is not always weakness. Sometimes silence is discernment. Sometimes silence is self-respect. Sometimes silence is the refusal to continue participating in emotionally destructive cycles. Emotionally mature people understand that not every feeling requires immediate expression. Not every conflict deserves endless discussion. And not every relationship deserves unlimited access to your energy. When you begin setting boundaries, something very uncomfortable happens internally. Guilt appears, especially if you are compassionate by nature. You may fear disappointing others. You may worry about appearing selfish or cold. But protecting your emotional health is not selfishness. Constant self-abandonment is not love. Many people were conditioned to believe that enduring emotional pain quietly is proof of loyalty. But loyalty without self-respect becomes self-destruction. If a relationship consistently requires you to betray your own emotional needs in order to preserve someone else's comfort, the relationship becomes psychologically unhealthy. You must also understand that boundaries reveal character. Healthy people may not always like your boundaries initially, but they eventually respect them. Manipulative or emotionally immature individuals often react differently. They may guilt you, mock your standards, withdraw affection, or accuse you of changing. Why? Because boundaries disrupt unhealthy access. And that discomfort is revealing. A person who truly values you will desire clarity, honesty, and mutual respect. They will not require your emotional exhaustion as proof of your love. There is also a profound psychological shift that occurs when you stop over-pursuing people emotionally. Your nervous system begins calming down. Your mind becomes clearer. You stop interpreting every interaction as a threat to your worth. You begin responding intentionally rather than reacting emotionally. That is the beginning of emotional stability. And perhaps most importantly, boundaries teach you something many wounded people forget. Your presence is valuable too. Your energy matters. Your peace matters. Your emotional life deserves protection. Never confuse endless tolerance with love. Real love can be compassionate while still refusing to accept repeated harm. One of the greatest mistakes people make after emotional heartbreak is believing that healing is primarily about getting someone back. They focus on becoming more attractive, more successful, more emotionally controlled, hoping that person, all growth, will eventually cause the other person to regret losing them. And while self-improvement can certainly produce external change, healing driven by revenge, validation, or emotional competition is still emotionally dependent on the very person who caused the pain. That is not freedom. That is attachment wearing a more sophisticated disguise. Real healing begins when your focus shifts from being chosen by someone else to rebuilding yourself from the inside outward. Because heartbreak does more than damage relationships. It often fractures identity. People lose routines, confidence, emotional security, future expectations, and sometimes even their sense of direction. A painful relationship can quietly consume so much emotional energy that when it ends, a person no longer remembers who they were before the suffering began. And this is why healing requires reconstruction, not distraction. Many individuals attempt to outrun emotional pain through busyness, new relationships, and vice entertainment or external achievements. But unresolved wounds rarely disappear through avoidance. They simply become quieter until another emotional experience reactivates them. Human beings carry unprocessed pain into future relationships all the time. Fear becomes control. Betrayal becomes distrust. Abandonment becomes emotional defensiveness. And slowly, the hurt that was never healed begins shaping behavior in ways the person themselves may not even recognize. This is why self-awareness becomes essential. Healing is not simply feeling better emotionally. Healing is understanding yourself more honestly. It is recognizing the patterns, fears, insecurities, and emotional dependencies that pain exposed within you. Difficult relationships often function like mirrors. They reveal where we seek validation too desperately, where we tolerate disrespect too long, where we abandon our instincts, and where we confuse emotional intensity with genuine connection. Pain, when examined why, can become a teacher instead of merely a wound. But that transformation requires humility. It requires the courage to stop idealizing the relationship and start evaluating it truthfully. Sometimes people mourn relationships not because the relationship itself was healthy, but because they invested enormous emotional hope into what they wanted it to become. And letting go of that imagined future can feel like grieving a life that never fully existed. Yet emotional maturity demands reality over fantasy. There is also something deeply spiritual about rebuilding yourself after heartbreak, because suffering has a way of stripping away illusions. It exposes what truly sustains you when external comfort disappears. Some people emerge from pain more bitter, suspicious, and emotionally hardened. Others emerge wiser, calmer, more grounded, and more aware of what truly matters. The difference often lies in whether suffering becomes an identity or a lesson. If pain becomes your identity, you remain emotionally trapped in the past. But if pain becomes instruction, you begin growing beyond it. And growth is rarely dramatic at first. It appears quietly. You start sleeping peacefully again. You stop obsessively checking for messages. You laugh without forcing it. You regain interest in your own life. Your thoughts become less consumed by one person. The emotional storm gradually loses authority over your nervous system. And one day you realize something remarkable. The relationship that once felt like the center of your world no longer controls your inner peace. That is healing. Not because the memories vanished, not because the hurt never mattered, but because you finally stopped making another human being the foundation of your emotional identity. This is important because emotionally dependent relationships often create psychological imbalance. One person becomes the source of purpose, security, validation, and emotional regulation. But no human being was designed to carry that kind of responsibility perfectly. When your entire emotional world revolves around one person, losing them can feel like losing yourself. So healing requires rediscovering life beyond emotional fixation. It requires reconnecting with purpose, discipline, friendships, faith, creativity, peace, and personal growth, independent of romantic attachment. And ironically, when you become emotionally whole again, you no longer seek relationships from desperation. You approach them from stability. That changes everything. Because emotionally healthy people do not love to escape loneliness. They love from a place of fullness rather than emotional starvation. They can care deeply without abandoning themselves completely. And perhaps the deepest sign that you have truly healed is this: you stop needing your pain to be witnessed in order for it to matter. You no longer require revenge, regret, or validation to move forward. Your peace becomes internal rather than conditional. Do know, by measure healing by whether someone returns. Measure healing by whether you finally return to yourself.